Okay, another week in the process of globalization.
A very big
And
week.
the speed seems to be increasing all the time. Um, and it's one thing for us to pick out particular things that happened during the week that we really would like to be able to say why they happened, when they happened, and where they happened. It's another thing to understand the underlying process, which is the context of everything that's happening and the rate of change. And one of the things that came across my desk this past week I found particularly interesting. It was the last week's issue of The Economist,
Okay.
in which they have a special section on the way the value of land is changing and the way that is affecting other things, which I think is something that is generally not understood and has not really been noticed as part of this larger change. I mean, we know that that land became important as something to own, starting, I suppose, 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution. And then the land was the basis of the aristocratic class in Europe until, well, in England, until the revolutions in some parts of Europe, and in England until the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happening now is that more and more land is being taken out of agriculture and built on in cities. More and more people are living in denser and denser quarters, and the value of land in cities is going up in ways that are actually having an effect on the economy in large urbanizing, globalizing societies. And whereas agricultural land had its value from its agricultural production, that's not you can't say the same about the land that costs a fortune in the center of New York or London.
Right.
And the increase there it seems to be accelerating. But what is even more interesting than this observation is something which I think I noticed in my the introductory essay in my book on globalization, which is that gradually, as social networking increases, which after all has been going on for a long time, and it's been possible for it to expand at an accelerating rate over the last few decades, and we spend more of our time in virtual reality instead of face-to-face meeting. We cease to actually live in such. We cease to need to live in such dense urban environments, and there's a good chance that gradually the price of land will come down again. And land will cease to be so important in that way and may once again return to a more economically useful function in society. Anyway, that's the message of last week's Economist, which I thought was particularly interesting as a new dimension of globalization.
It is interesting because land is really at the heart of the English common law judicial system. It's really probably the earliest antecedent as to laws against trespass, laws against land conveyance. It gave rise to the law of contracts, the law of torts. And when you begin to get into property law, I mean, you're immediately struck by how far back the case law studies go. And your point's well taken. We're almost looking in terms of geologic time, I suppose, in some respects, if I may, insofar as watching the tide recede on the need for urbanization by using social media. But I think the observation is inevitable, actually. Yes, you're right. I mean, there will come a time where people will say, well, why am I living chock-a-block here in downtown Hong Kong, for example, when I could be living on an acre of land somewhere else, be comfortable?
But it also introduces something else about the significance in the difference between different parts of the world. in the rate of globalization and the stage of globalization that societies have reached. Because in Africa, for example, there has never been any, well, for most of Africa, there's not been any large-scale land ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Land ownership is generally a problem. Now, cities are growing very fast, but they're a relatively small part of the total amount of land compared to other parts of the developing world. So it highlights important factors in the differences between Europe, India, Asia, and Africa in the rate of globalization. And it's these differences that underlie the continuing problems in the way societies relate to each other and in much of the conflicts that that arises.
It could be that the land alienability and then the land use could be almost a litmus marker or a litmus test to gauge rate of globalization, rate of change, that type of thing. That's a very interesting observation.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I'm particularly interested in at the moment because it all has to do with whether or not we're going to be able to feed ourselves when we're a global community of 10 billion people, most of whom are living in cities. And of course, at the moment, we all assume that the cities will all be dense, urban clusters of skyscrapers.
Mm-hmm.
But and so far the developing world has tried to outdo the developed world in the height of its skyscrapers.
Mm-hmm.
But that may be we may be approaching a new change in that process because the ability for any state to attract people to a very small amount of land may be decreasing.
Right.
So I'm not sure how long it will take before we can see whether that idea actually has any validity.
You know, there was an interesting article in the New York Times yesterday talking about something that's occurring in, of all places, in Newark, New Jersey, which still remains a bit of a decaying urban center. The article spoke about how a company that is already established has purchased a very, very large, old manufacturing plant that had long been abandoned, stripped out the insides of it. In fact, it's on a brownfield site, put in some sort of polyurethane coating as the floor, and then raised the floor to create seed beds, and in fact brought in soil. And the company is now growing kale, a lot of it, on this site, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of kale annually, and selling it locally, as it's all organically produced, selling it locally as locally produced food. And the company also has similar activities, I believe I read, in Detroit and in other places. And they're not the only ones doing this. I mean, there's this use now for these aging industrial shells that, if people haven't come in and bought them yet and demolished them to create new buildings, these entrepreneurs are coming in and doing that. It's just, certainly it's going to be a drop in the bucket insofar as the global food crisis or impending global food crisis is concerned. But it just was an interesting correlation of the discussion that we're having now.
Well, there is an increasing amount of small-scale agriculture being conducted in cities, and I think it's happening in China as well as in Philadelphia and places like New Jersey. But I wonder how much that can expand unless the price of urban land goes down.
Right, right.
And these people in New Jersey presumably are not paying for the land.
I think they got the building at like a dollar a year, that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, the other interesting point is, I mean, this I do feel compelled to ask this. If we're talking about a very heavy concentration of humanity in the future, all congregating in urban areas, that would presume that the rural areas are even less sparsely populated than they are now. So there is a lot of arable land out there. that can be used for crop growing. I mean, I guess the surmise is that the people aren't going to be there to produce the food, the farmers, the agricultural people.
That's the way it is at the moment, but if virtual reality reaches its, I mean, if we finish up being able to use virtual reality in the ways we would like, then it won't, it will make it possible for people to live wherever they want to live without it affecting their ability to interact with others, and make it possible for us to use land in a much more proficient way. I mean, agricultural land, after all, has to be improved to be productive and requires some degree of investment, even if it's only labor. And so people have to decide to live in a particular place and invest the labor, if not other things, into the land in order to make it productive. But it's very likely that that is going to happen, I think.
If you had to name, just off the top of your head, the top three countries who are importers of food without holding you to it, who'd you name? Which three?
Well, Singapore, Iran, and another one was mentioned in a conversation I had today, and I'm trying to remember which one it was. But
not China.
China does import food. It imports a lot of milk. But I don't think it's dependent upon food imports for staples.
Okay. And the milk is probably a Western acquired taste that they didn't have.
Well, it's interesting that the taste for milk has increased quite suddenly in the second half of the 20th century, and now an enormous, I mean, the American ability to produce milk has increased enormously. I forget the figures now, but the amount of milk produced by a single cow in a particular number of years in a milk producing cycle is quite amazing at the moment. It's much, we have people from the School of Veterinary Medicine here over in China helping the Chinese to increase their milk production, but at the moment their milk production per cow is nothing like America's. And America is exporting enormous amounts of milk because Americans are actually drinking less milk since they were told that milk wasn't good for them, or at least milk wasn't good for them.
Right. I would imagine that countries in the Middle East are also import dependent as well, many of them anyway.
Well, certainly some of them are, but I can't tell you, besides Iran, to what extent they're dependent on food imports.
So logically then, if people begin to recede back into rural areas and get closer to the land, then we're still going to be faced with those same impetus or impeti, whatever the singular is, that motivated people to move into the urban areas to begin with. The idea of communality, the idea of social interaction. I guess what we're thinking is that all of that is going to be overcome by so-called virtual communality.
Yes, I mean, the point is that the advantages of having more and more people clustered together is going to cease to be a spatial advantage and become more of a virtual advantage. It's in fact the culmination of the digital revolution, I suppose.
Yeah, which is a pretty big seminal acknowledgement to make, I would think, don't you think? I mean, considering only a few years ago, people would scratch their head in response to a statement like that.
And it's amazing how fast this change has happened, and it's affecting the way in everything we do in our dealings with each other, and we don't really understand what's going on. And so it's very interesting and useful when journals like The Economist see what's going on with land as a particular factor which everybody understands. If you talk about just social interaction, it's difficult for people to understand what you're talking about, but if you talk about land, it means something to them because everybody has some interest in land. And if the way land fits the economy is going through a total conversion, that's something, the significance of which makes sense to people.
Yeah, I think it's a very good observation.
One wonders what the next thing will be, because I think the point is that in the process of globalization, the meaning of everything is changing.
Well, can we talk a little bit about?
Has to do.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, about what?
Well, I was going to ask you about what seems to be the unevenness of globalization insofar as even within the state of Iran, which seems to have the population as a whole overjoyed at the so-called preliminary agreement, and even the Revolutionary Guard coming out yesterday endorsing it, and then the Supreme Leader today tying everything to lifting the economic sanctions, taking a major step back. And
well, actually, both Zarif and Rouhani have been saying this earlier, and they they wanted the first interim agreement to be completed, at least within not too long after the deadline, to make sure that the process kept going.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, there's no point in them having any agreement unless the sanctions are dropped. And so now they're introducing it again, and they're introducing it in a very politically savvy way from the top down. So it's not the negotiators who are saying it, although they're supporting it. And they're giving Obama and others something to think about, because obviously the sanctions, it's ridiculous. If Iran's keeping their side of the bargain, then why should the sanctions be continued? What's the reason for the sanctions?
I agree, but I had thought that the idea of the departure of the sanctions was going to be in a phased way based upon continued performance by Iran.
Well, but Iran doesn't want to do its side of the bargain without the absolute assurance that the other side is going to keep its side of the bargain.
No, I understand that. I mean, but when
there has to be they have to be doing it together so they can watch each other. And actually, Iran has more. Despite what America says, Iran has more reason to distrust America than America has to distrust Iran.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I saw the Supreme Leader's remarks today, I was like, oh my God, Obama must be ready to jump out the window. I mean, this is ridiculous. So I don't know. He's just lending fuel to the fire for the conservatives here.
No, I think it's all politics, and they're watching very carefully public opinion in Iran as well, because they want their regime to be popular in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
But the point to remember about Iran all the time, which I think I've said before, is that it's an urban society, and it's an urban society of some 80 million people, and so they have a sort of and they're very computerized, even though their access to the global internet may be restricted to some extent. But there's, I mean, I'm in email connection with people in Iran all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They're very well connected to the rest of the world, and in fact, there's people flying back and forth to Iran, between Iran and the West all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very different society from other parts of the Middle East, even though, of course, it has a lot of internal problems. But I think that everything that goes on politically in Iran has to be evaluated very differently from the way we think about other parts of the Middle East.
No, I don't disagree with that. And now the Iranians are, of course, paying very close attention to what's going on in Yemen.
Well, and once again, they're getting a very bad press over it for all the wrong reasons.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely, if America has an interest in Yemen, so does Iran.
Mm-hmm.
If America has do things in Yemen, why can't Iran do things in Yemen?
And the Chinese were even there. A naval vessel picked up about 150 foreigners, including British, Germans, and French citizens.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Aden used to be a separate country until not very long ago. It's now it wasn't exactly an entirely internal process that led to it being united with what used to be called Yemen, with capital Sana'a, which used to be a Shia state. And there's absolutely no reason why the Yemenis that are Shia shouldn't have a relationship with Iran.
Right, right.
In fact, there's no reason why any country shouldn't have a relationship with a particular other country that it feels it shares ideas with.
Well,
so it's all a question of America's allies versus Iran's allies, and those are the things that need to be rethought, reconsidered.
Well, I remain very optimistic.
It seems to me that Saudi Arabia is, although under Salman at first it seemed to be uncompromising in its attitude towards foreign affairs and international relations in the region, it seems to be revising its ideas and more open to discussion and finding ways to reach a wider agreement about relations between the different players in the Middle Eastern problem.
Well, that would be the ultimate goal if the Saudi king could begin to negotiate directly with Tehran.
Certainly, a direct negotiation between the leader of the guardian of the holy places and the leader of the Shia community would be a landmark,
a momentous event. Well, let's work toward that.
Even more significant than a meeting between the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I would say so, yes. All right. Well, Professor, thank you very much for your time. We'll look forward to next week.
Okay.
All right. Bye.